That's the Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird today on the growing threat from militant groups like ISIS to Canada's national security. The federal government is considering what commitment it will make to the U.S.-led coalition abroad. We could learn more details on that tomorrow. Will we send jets or not? Meantime, a new handbook released today is designed to confront the homegrown terrorist threat. 38-page guide. It's called United Against Terrorism, and it was developed by various Muslim groups alongside the RCMP. The goal is to get at what's driving radicalization and what can be done to reverse the trend. So what role should Muslims play in protecting Canada's national security? Joining me now from Winnipeg, Ihsaan Gardee is the Executive Director for the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and Shahina Siddiqui is the President of the Islamic Social Services Association. Good to have both of you back on the program.
Thank you. Thanks.
Let me start with you, Mr. Gardee. This new handbook has been developed by the RCMP and by various Muslim groups, including yours. What was the objective behind it?
Firstly, Evan, thanks for having us on. I just want to correct the record that this is actually a community-driven initiative. This is not an RCMP handbook. The RCMP were consulted and did provide input for their section of the handbook so that Canadian Muslims have a better understanding of exactly what their role is in national security. In regards to the objectives, this is a handbook that is for Muslim community leaders, for communities across Canada, to give them a better idea of what this phenomenon of violent extremism is and some of the aspects of it, and really to provide them with practical tools that they can use to help challenge this phenomenon.
Shahina Siddiqui, what was, in your view, what was the motivation to begin this?
I think there was a big gap of information within the community, not understanding what was happening. There was shock that we have our Muslim Canadian youths going overseas to fight with terrorist groups, how they were being recruited. Families were suffering. We were literally grappling to understand this. And so in 2013, we called a town hall. The 200 community members attended, where we generated questions as to what their concerns were. And many were about what are the red flags? How do we know our kid is a child is being recruited or is radicalized towards violence? What can we do when there are Islamophobic messages coming from different directions? How do we address them? So just trying to take a comprehensive look at this issue.
Outline what some of these red flags that you're mentioning are.
You know, very similar to group gang recruitment. So if a parent suddenly sees the child is isolating themselves, they have given up their regular friends, they are oversaturated in overseas news. Suddenly, world is black and white. They're exhibiting hyper-religiosity, which is not part of the family culture. It's extreme, sudden onset. Misogynic kind of anti-women rhetoric. And when they are challenged on their views, they get very aggressive. And these are, again, not characteristics that were seen in them prior to. Having secret meetings, watching websites, and then closing it as soon as a parent or somebody can.
One of the issues in this brochure, Ihsaan Gardee, is, and I'll read it, how do you separate radicalization from violence and hate? Anyone can hold radical, geopolitical, economic, or environmental or social ideas. Being a radical is often seen as a legitimate form of political philosophy. By the same token, violence and hate has to be guarded against. So how do you enforce this line without essentially having an Islamic community that's spying on anyone that has quote-unquote radical ideas?
Well, that's a good point that you make, Evan, and that's why it's so important for us to make the distinction between radicalization and radicalization towards extremist violence. Some of the most well-known social changes that we have seen have come about through radical movements, protests against the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King was once considered a radical. So we have to make that distinction clear. It's when the individual espouses, endorses, or supports violence as the only solution to their grievance that it becomes a real issue of concern. So we need to really understand this phenomenon in order to be able to tackle it. And that's why we've come out with this handbook, and we're working with together with organizations, and the Muslim community has been and continues to be at the forefront of tackling this issue. It's not something that we take lightly. As far as we're concerned, one person radicalized towards extremist violence is one too many.
Well, you say that. You even take this on, and many people will want in this brochure, I want people to realize, you take on the question, has the Muslim community failed to combat this in and of itself, quote unquote? Why did our community not come through to combat these messages in the wake of 9/11? Has that been a failure of the community, Shahina Siddiqui?
You know, for our message to get out, we need the medium. So if the media is continuously going to repeat that we did not do anything, or there were no condemnation of 9/11 and other acts of violence, which did happen, the same medium is being used by the youth in our community, right? And the failure on our part is that while we were giving this message outside the community to the media, too busy addressing Islamophobia, we were not giving the same message within the community, taking it for granted that they knew that we were working. So when these kids go to school and they say, oh, your community never said anything, well, they didn't hear it. They probably didn't hear it in the media, and they assume that that's the case. And so you see that many questions that we have put out there, we wouldn't have had the confidence 5 years ago to put them out in the open and address them. Right. Now we are.
You know, what's interesting, Mr. Gardee, and you've been on our program before, is you are engaged in a lawsuit against the Prime Minister's office, specifically the Prime Minister's own Director of Communication, Jason MacDonald, naming him in a lawsuit for defamation and libel because words that he had expressed linking your organization to known terrorist groups. Now you're suing him. I guess, what does that tell you about the state of your community? You're involved in this, the RCMP is involved in this, and yet you got a lawsuit against one of the spokespeople for the Prime Minister.
Well, what I can tell you about the lawsuit, Evan, is that it's proceeding according to normal channels and taking normal steps. Our organization is a public organization. We've got a track record of 14 years, and our work is a matter of public knowledge. Right now,
what does it tell people that I mean, here you are trying to be proactive. You've got this United Against Terrorism, and yet, I mean, you're engaged in a lawsuit with the highest office in the land. What does that mean?
Well, that's a completely separate issue from what we're dealing with here today, and this is really a grassroots effort, Evan, to try and combat and challenge this phenomenon of radicalization to criminal violence. Look, we've got a number of fronts that we have to tackle this on. We need to educate Canadian Muslims about what their rights and responsibilities equally are as Canadian citizens, so that it doesn't become a narrative where rights supersede national security, or national security supersedes human rights. It's not a zero-sum game. We need to provide forums where young people who have grievances can air them in safe spaces. We need to provide them with civic engagement activities, ways that they can positively channel these grievances into ways that are really constructive and legal. And then finally, as Shahina was mentioning, we need to engage with the Canadian media as well, so that they understand that it's important not to conflate Islam and Muslims with the acts of extremists who use and really distort the faith to their own ends.
A critical point. I got 10 seconds. Have either of you yet seen any activity, the behavior of someone yourselves or in your communities, and reported it to the police or the RCMP? Have either of you ever seen that yourselves?
For individuals, no, not lately, but I am in contact. I sit on the advisory committee for the RCMP here. So we do talk about concerns and issues we have. We did have some youths going away from Manitoba. It was after the fact. So I have met with the families. So we know that there is grave concern on all parts, and that's why we just cannot hide our heads in the sand and say, oh, there's no issue. There is an issue. We need every sector in society, every stakeholder to come out and help us.
All right, I got to leave it there. Ihsaan Gardee, the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and Shahina Siddiqui, the President of the Islamic Social Services Association. Good to have both of you on the program.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you.